I mean, the fact is, we have two classes of problem. Let me talk about the more economic risk, and then I'll talk about the structural risk that we have. The economic risk is quite acute, that we have much more debt than we did 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, we had a crisis. So the same, it's like we cured the crisis, a debt crisis with debt. So we have accumulation of debt, and that's not very good. We also have an increase in moral hazard in the system. In other words, people gaming the system. More and more people are gaming the system. So we have to worry about it. But visibly, many people are concerned, and this is why they go to risk conferences. That's the first level. The second one, something I addressed in Skin in the Game, is that people are still unable to realize that there should be no risk management. You should study risk-taking, not risk management, because you cannot separate the income-generating technique from the risks associated with it. They're not separable. It's the same. It's a decision-making. And they all should be in a class of decision-making on uncertainty. So you should attract more risk takers. And in fact, I see some risk takers, but I'm saying that you have to worry about an industry that's dominated by non-risk takers discussing risks and separating the function from that of risk taking. Big data brings more risks than it solves. In principle, more data, the more knowledge we acquire, the more understanding we get. But in fact, with data comes a lot of noise. So people tend to drown in noise and have a lot of blind alleys, without knowing they're blind alleys. So there's a nice balance between technical knowledge and data, and that balance has been disrupted by too much data, but technical understanding has not grown. Tomorrow my lecture will be on how our grandmothers understand risks a lot better than so-called risk professionals. Machine learning will help you identify the profile of people capable of, cheating on their tax return or stuff like that. Machine learning cannot capture things in the class of risks I call fat tails. It will not, cannot. There's something like you cannot invent information. And also tomorrow I'll talk about paranoia. That we have a natural tendency to be paranoid. And we shouldn't tamper with it. And a lot of psychologists of risks are tampering with it, not realizing that when you look at the problem and under richer assumptions from probability theory, in fact, your grandmother is correct and the psychologists of risk are wrong. You should have a lot of paranoia about what I call ruin and be more risk-taking in things that do not entail ruin. So the class of things that have ruin in them, worry. And in fact, a lot of people take ruin risks, but not regular risks. Try to avoid. To have a smooth income while taking a lot of tail risk, what I call tail risk, rather than just have more volatility of income but less tail risk. Every time you have a crisis, you have a chance for people who know how to play with crises to make some money, either with the crisis or coming out of the crisis, when other people are shell-shocked because they lost money in the crisis. So people have this notion that everybody should lose money at the same time. It's not the case. There's a class of people. And you have to just learn how to handle a crisis ahead of time. Let me give you a sobering statistic. More than 50% of psychology papers do not replicate. Okay? I'm sure that more than 99% of what your grandmother told you holds and will hold. Collective experience over time, dynamically, not from someone who just looked at a model, did some naive statistics and came up with a conclusion. I've described the last crisis, after it happened, but also quite a bit before it happened, by explaining that the world has lost its island properties. So you had isolated islands, and when you have an island, you have a lot more biological diversity in an island than you do in a continent. And there's some people call it square law, because the larger the continent, the more species you're going to have, but the density will decrease. So since then, now the world is dominated by Facebook, by a few names, and so you see that for example, If you're a soccer player, a football player, 100 years ago or 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you made a good income. I mean, it was more distributed. Today it's a winner-take-all effect. Now that winner-take-all effect we're observing because of globalization worldwide in economic life. It causes inequalities, but it also causes instability because the road to the top, say the road to becoming Facebook or Google or Apple at the time was short, the road back, to the college dorms, wherever they started, to the garage, is also equally short. So this tells us that you're going to have more and more concentration, more unfairness, but the system will calibrate itself by making the one at the top collapse so someone else can come to the top. If you tamper with it, you make people at the top become frozen in that position, and that's not good for the system long run. I would like to have more. I mean, I can understand the fight, the rise against globalism, because people want to have their own little industries, their own little industrial diversity preserved. And globalists sort of don't get it. They don't get that it's nice to have a global world, but with it comes concentration. So what do you want? You want concentration, or do you want fairness? So they don't quite get it. But I think that with time, people are realizing that when you look at complexity models and apply them to the world, that some things taken for granted in economics, like economies of scale or globalization, they don't really hold. I have no idea how to predict, but let me give you a rule. I call it the Lindy effect. Is the way I write my books is I make sure you can read them today, they're interesting today. But if I want people to interest people 10 years from now, I write something that would have been relevant today and 10 years ago. You see, this is how you don't just add things. So I think that we'll be talking next year about what we're talking about today, jointly today, and would have discussed 10 years ago or 20 years ago, given that I'm a veteran of this.